Welkom allemaal, welkom mensen van de NCG. We zijn hier vandaag voor de derde sessie over de Groningse aardbevingen. Vorige week hebben we 2 sessies gehad. Eén over de geologische oorsprong van de aardbevingen zelf, gerelateerd aan de gaswinning. En één over de juridische ontwikkelingen rondom de aardbeving en vooral de afhandelingen en dergelijke. Vandaag gaan we het iets anders doen. We zitten iets dichter op de bewoner, zoals in ons mooie plaatje, wat ik vorige week heb geïntroduceerd. U kunt het daar zien. We gaan iets meer afstand nemen van de problematiek. En kijken wat meer naar de context. En dat is vooral belangrijk, want Groningen is niet uniek in dit geval. Er zijn heel veel grote gaswinningsprojecten en andersoortige mijnbouwprojecten, waar eigenlijk soortgelijke problemen een rol spelen. Dat krijgt allerlei vormen, maar uiteindelijk een aantal essentiële onderdelen zijn eigenlijk hetzelfde. Vandaag gaan we dan kijken naar de Social Impact Assessments. Dus staat bovenaan op de rand van ons mooie plaatje. Dit is dus belangrijk om hier aandacht aan te besteden, ook om wat meer context te geven over wat hier aan de hand is. Vandaag hebben we hoogleraar Frank Vanclay, oorspronkelijk uit Australië, sinds enige jaren werkzaam hier in Groningen. Hij is een professor in Spatial Sciences en eigenlijk een world-leading expert op het terrein van Social Impact Assessment. Hij zal zichzelf zo verder wat meer introduceren.
Well, I'm a professor of cultural geography in the Faculty of Spatial Sciences at the University of Groningen. So cultural geography is about people and place, and the importance of a sense of place or place attachment to people's identities and lives. A sense of place is fundamental and essential aspect of being human. Now, big projects negatively affect people's sense of place because projects alter the landscape and the environment in ways that are not always accepted by local people. When people are strongly upset, they protest. How people are affected and how the impacts can be avoided and managed is what we mean by the social impacts of projects. And this is a topic that I've been researching my whole academic life. I've been very fortunate to have had many PhD and master's students from all over the world, as well as some Dutch students who have wanted to research abroad. And they've studied places in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, the Arctic, various countries in Europe, and even from Australia, where I'm originally from. So consequently, I have a broad perspective, and I've learned a lot from my various supervision experiences. Now, my talk today is largely based on the 4 papers that you see depicted on this screen. From all of my research, the most important and perhaps most obvious thing is that all projects create social impacts. These impacts can be negative as well as positive. Some impacts are positive and intended. Some impacts are not necessarily intended, but are nonetheless accepted as being an inevitable part of achieving project goals. And other impacts may be completely unanticipated. The key point of my talk today is that we should be able to assess and manage the social impacts of projects a whole lot better than we have been doing. Now, social impact assessment is a field of research and practice that's been around since around 1970. It's actually very much like environmental impact assessment, milieu, effect and rapportage in Dutch. And social impact assessment developed alongside environmental impact assessment in 1970. So my first interest in social impact assessment started from about 1980, and it's been my life's passion ever since. I've been author of many of the key books in this field, and many of the key papers and documents. In fact, the papers, documents that you see now are some of the defining documents that establish what this field is all about. And these documents have been the basis of the guidelines of several countries. So I've shown one from the state of New South Wales in Australia, but also in Taiwan, as well as various other organisations, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank. So essentially what I'm interested in are things like, what are the social impacts created by projects? Why does the community acceptance of impacts vary from place to place and from project to project? How can the negative impacts be avoided or reduced? Actually, the technical term for this is called mitigation. So how do we mitigate the impacts of the negative impacts of projects? I'm also interested in how the benefits from projects can be enhanced. Actually, one of the biggest negative impacts is that the alleged benefits don't actually eventuate, or many of the benefits that could have been obtained are not obtained because they're not adequately considered in a project. And then part of that is how we should help a project to ensure that it gets acceptability and has a social license to operate in the local communities where it operates. So to think about the Groningen context for a moment, so taking Groningen as an example, the gas quakes clearly have created fear and anxiety, a lot of uncertainty about the future. There's a huge amount of stress being created, and as a result of that, there's much stress-related health conditions. People feel unsafe. They have unease and dread. They have changed feelings about their home and their community, and even the place where they live itself. And there's a lot of distrust about the government. People feel alienated and disconnected from what's going on. In addition to that, there's a lot of nuisance, annoyance and frustration. There's administrative hassle. There's disruption to daily life. There's also impacts from the intrusion of the workers who deal with the damage from the gas quakes. There's strangers in their community, and there's even voyeurs, people coming to have a look at what all the fuss is about. In fact, many of the people in the Groningen countryside have complained about the throngs of journalists at various times that have been doing stories, and this in itself is a social impact. There's also reduced property values, there's reduced future business activity, and there's a lot of construction impacts from the repairs as well as from the strengthening projects that are being undertaken. So these impacts are very real for the people experiencing them. But there's much more to this story that I want to present in this talk. So whether we're talking about a goldfield in Ghana, or a pipeline in Georgia, or dams anywhere in the world, this picture's in Georgia, or oil developments in Uganda or anywhere else, or mining anywhere. Even solar farms create social impacts. There's lots of land acquisition for solar farms. There's water use that may deprive local communities. So many of these projects that are green projects can have severe negative impacts around the world. And of course, we're all familiar with the issue of wind farms in Groningen. Even the creation of protected areas or national parks create negative social impacts and may lead to the eviction of local people and the destruction of their livelihoods. This is in Ethiopia, in the Simien Mountains. So, and of course here in Groningen, lots of impacts. In all of these cases, people are pushed into fighting against big projects in order to protect their rights, to protect their livelihoods, their culture, and their way of living. Now, extractive industries are particularly problematic. Extractive industries generally have a large land take and create much displacement of people. That's not perhaps true in the Groningen case, but in terms of mining projects generally, it's certainly true. Many of the extractive industries are never justified to local people. They are commercial projects for the benefit of companies, and they're not seen as contributing local benefits to local people. They're often unpopular and have a poor reputation. They're high-cost projects, often in the billions of euros, and consequently mostly are what are called mega projects. They have complex governance arrangements. They're often associated with corruption, and they're often pushed through regulatory processes, they're fast-tracked, because they're perceived to be in the national interest. And the argument that because they're in the national interest, things like the normal assessment procedures, environmental impact assessment, social impact assessment, don't need to apply. Now, it doesn't always have to be like that. Actually, it's very interesting that NUM in Groningen, of course, has a bad reputation amongst local people, but in Schönebeek, local people are very much in favour of NUM. NUM was originally developed not because of gas in Groningen. NUM was originally developed because of oil in Schönebeek. And the story in Schönebeek is a very different story, where there's very strong support for NUM, and there's a very positive view of the community, and the contribution that NUM has made to the community is tremendous. So we can clearly say that in Schönebeek, there has been a social license to operate. So why is it that NUM got a strong social license to operate in Schönebeek and has not managed to maintain the social license to operate, at least in Groningen after the gas quakes? So in my field of research and practice, social impact assessment, there's quite a bit that we know about the nature of social impacts and how they should be managed. The very first thing is that social issues are complex phenomenon. They're not black and white issues like this picture depicts. They're complex phenomenon that are difficult to assess, they're difficult to manage. People will have different views about these, and considerable experience and care is needed in addressing these issues. It's not something that can be easily done by somebody who is just assigned this task to manage. It's a professional area and needs proper attention. We also know that social impacts vary in time and in space, and we can conceive of social impacts in different ways. Social impacts can be in the form of direct impacts, which happen in the same time and same space. We can conceive of them as being indirect impacts, which occur later in time or at a different place, or as a result of some complex pathway of how impacts are created. And if we might talk about direct impacts as being first-order impacts, and we can talk about indirect impacts as being second or higher-order impacts. And there's also cumulative impacts, and cumulative impacts refers to the incremental and combined impacts from one or more projects. And they can result either from the simple aggregation of impacts or from the way that the impacts themselves interact. And thinking about all projects everywhere, what we tend to realize is that second and higher order impacts tend to cause more harm than the first order impacts. This is a very important awareness, because how we assess impacts and how we manage them means that much more attention has to be given to the causal sequences by which the first order impacts then go on to cause other impacts. Another favourite expression of mine is that almost all projects almost always cause almost all impacts. And that comes from the notion that impacts cause other impacts, which then cause other impacts. In fact, in one of my papers, there's a differentiation between what's a social change process and what exactly is a social impact. But it's a reiterative cyclical process, which means that lots of projects create lots of impacts. Now, as we've seen in Groningen, a key point of this understanding is that protest actions indicate there's opposition to a project. And one of the problems of all projects in the past is that they've failed to appreciate the signs that they did not have a social license to operate. They failed to appreciate the importance of having a social license to operate. And if projects managed their community relations and social impacts much better in the first place, then they wouldn't have the massive protests that have occurred. So we know that good process is essential. It's everything. If I ask you to think for a moment about where you live, imagine that you woke up one morning and the street outside of where you lived was dug up. You could not get out of the door. Imagine you were getting a delivery and the delivery vehicle could not arrive at your door because of the street being dug up. You would feel annoyed. You could, if you were cross or angry or something else was happening in your life, you might be very annoyed. But imagine that you'd been sent a letter a month earlier to say, we're very sorry, but we have to dig up your street in order to put in the fibre optic cable, which will give you super fast internet. Then the project becomes acceptable. So the experience of impact is completely related to the effectiveness of the process by which the project is implemented. And when people believe that a project is worthwhile and in their best interests, they accept whatever inconvenience comes with the project. So the experience and the anger associated with negative social impacts is often related to the perception of the lack of legitimacy of the project. So process is essential to get legitimacy. And as I said at the beginning, all projects create negative and positive social impacts, whether they're good projects or bad projects. All projects need to manage their social interaction and their social impacts. Now, skilled social impact assessment professionals will be aware of what impacts are created by what projects and in what circumstances. But it's not always possible to identify all of the impacts. And in fact, sometimes, because second and higher order impacts are more important than first order impacts, the impacts that happen later might not have been thought about at the beginning. In fact, that's exactly the case in the Groningen situation, where the gas quakes are a completely unanticipated event. As I understand it, controlled subsidence was expected, but it was not. But the earthquakes, as such, were completely unexpected. So, because it's impossible to always predict the impacts that will occur at the beginning of a project or before a project starts, there always needs to be a process of ongoing management, monitoring, and adaptive management. The other really important thing to consider with social impacts is that it's not just about winners and losers. People are differentially affected by projects. People can be positively and negatively affected at the same time, depending on which role they're playing at that point in time. How people are affected and what they think about that will change over time. And what is positive and what is negative can be ambiguous or even not evident at all. so it's complex. And impacts vary as a result of many things. They vary as a result of the characteristics of a project. They vary as a result of the characteristics of the mitigation that's undertaken. They vary according to the characteristics of the community, how vital it is, how viable it is, how much resilience there is in the community, what the impact history of the community is. They vary according to the characteristics of individuals. They vary according to the behaviour of the project and of its staff. And impacts are not stable, and they differentially affect people, which makes the whole business of predicting impacts a dynamic process, not a static process. And it's essential to realise that even good projects that are in the public interest have negative social impacts, and even good projects need to manage their social impacts. So we need to change the way that we consider the relationship between a project and its local communities or its host communities. And instead of viewing communities as either future victims or passive victims that have inability to do anything about it, we're much better taking an active role for communities where they can exercise agency, where they would know that they have the ability to influence change, where they can seize the opportunities that exist, where they can consider how best to respond and to react to all the issues, and where they can maximise the potential benefits and minimise the harm from projects. To actively manage the change means assessing and managing the negative impacts. It means creating a shared vision for the future where the type of project a community would want is part of that vision, and where the project can actually contribute to the achievement of that vision. We need to create opportunities for all to engage in the community and with the project, and to ensure that there's a fair distribution of benefits that are created. We need to demand and implement good governance in relation to the project, and we need to demand respect for human rights. So, thinking about projects. Could a mining project ever be green? Looking at this picture, it's hard to see that it could be. And of course, coal mining is very much unacceptable now in given the climate change considerations. However, it's important to realise that mining projects contribute foreign export earnings, they contribute taxes and royalties, they provide jobs, and the jobs then contribute to people's well-being. They create business development opportunities for small to medium enterprises in the community. Good projects would have a social investment contribution that they make in local communities. They can also contribute what's called shared infrastructure, where the project helps the local community by providing infrastructure, for example, electricity or water, sewage. And the projects themselves contribute an economic stimulus to the region. So there are lots of ways in which extractive industries make positive benefits to society if they're managed properly. But if they're not done well, the projects displace people, they create inflation, they create corruption, they lead to increased inequality in a community. There can be pollution and environmental destruction. There can be a loss of traditional livelihoods and a devaluing of traditional culture. Now, what about biodiversity or green projects? Again, the Simien Mountains in Ethiopia. It's a photo I took. They too create physical displacement of people. impoverishment, a decline in the quality of life and of their all well-being and livelihood indicators. They can cause human rights abuses. And in fact, around the world, there's very few examples of biodiversity projects that have a social license to operate. So, if we were making plans to manage this effectively, what should we be thinking about? Well, the first thing is the contract with the project. Are the conditions of the contract fair? Are the royalty payments appropriate? And is there commitment implemented in the contract, so part of the contract conditions, that there be effective environmental and social management? Does the operator have the necessary competencies to ensure that all environmental and social safeguards are properly undertaken? And that means, is there sufficient budget for this? Is there sufficient staff with appropriate skills to do the necessary tasks? It's also important to be aware that the government has a key role. In fact, in the Netherlands, that's clearly been the case, but in many countries, it's not been. The government should be ensuring that that the contracts yield proper returns to the state and to the community, that there is proper monitoring of contract conditions to ensure that there is effective environmental and social management and monitoring of this, that there is no corruption or rent-seeking opportunities where people find ways to extract extra benefit that they're not really entitled to. And the government needs to ensure that there's wise investment of royalty earnings and that it's not wasted on things that are not appropriate. All the risks need to be properly assessed. And what is thought of as being a risk needs to be considered. And of course, engineers are very good at looking about engineering risks, but they're not necessarily the right people to be thinking about what the social risks might be. We need to appreciate that actually it's a new age where there are lots of social risks, and that means both risks to the community as well as risks to the project from community opposition, which largely arises because of the risks to the community. So risks to the community become risks to the project, and there needs to be much more awareness of these social or non-technical risks. Now, when people are threatened, when people's sense of place is changing, when people feel that projects are not in the best interests of their community, they mobilize against the project and they engage in many forms of protest, over 200. So with one of my PhD students, we did a big assessment of all the different ways in which protest occurs, and we came up with over 200 forms of protest. Now, some protests are, in effect, harmless. In fact, no protest is harmless because all protest affects the reputation of a company or a project, and even of the government. But other forms of protest can be much more direct and have create violence, lead to violence, or may lead to damage to property. So the possible effects of all these forms of protest include physical damage to the plant. It includes lost production because of a shutdown or unable to produce because of barricades or blockades. It can lead to greater attention being placed on the operations by the legal authorities, which might lead to a loss of legal license. And in fact, that's what's happened in Groningen. There can be court actions against a project. There can be fines by the regulator. There can be demands for compensation. There can be loss of reputation and a stock market reaction to that. There can be a loss of access to new sites. Extra conditions might be imposed on the operations. There can be increased cost of insurance and of finance. And there's a cost of the staff time in dealing with the protests and the issues surrounding the protests. There's costs of board time in dealing with these issues. And there's the opportunity cost of the diverted attention from all of this. So all of this means that opposition to projects has a huge cost to projects. So when we're talking about the need to get a social license to operate, it's not some fuzzy, soft thing. We're talking about real consequences. And it clearly is in the interests of projects to ensure that they have effective relations with communities and a social license to operate. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of NIMBY, or not in my backyard. And this is a concept that started because of awareness that it was difficult to implement locally unwanted land uses. What that meant was things that we all need in a community, but that we find hard to place near communities. And the project perception of this concept is to blame the opposition to projects. They're just NIMBYists, people protecting their own interests and opposing a project. So, and that's led to a lot of project staff having negative views about the community. Now, I think that's a very limited and inadequate way of thinking about why people oppose projects. It's much better to start saying, how could we have a PIMBY? How could we have please in my backyard, or YIMBY, yes in my backyard? What would it take to get a positive commitment to the projects that we need in our community? So going from NIMBY to PIMBY requires that projects treat communities with respect. Any community, any person that feels that they are being belittled by a company or a project is not going to regard the project as being acceptable. Treating communities with respect is fundamental, and in fact it is reflected in all the other issues I'm going to mention. Projects need to demonstrate the social value of the project. There has to be a contribution to the local community. There needs to be full disclosure and transparency. Projects need to engage with local communities and empower local communities to fully participate in decision-making and discussions around the project. There needs to be local benefits, local procurement, local content. Projects need to genuinely commit to social and environmental management and do it properly. And they need to earn trust and a social license to operate. So I've used this term social license to operate many times now. You should be all aware that it refers to the acceptability of a project or the social legitimacy of a project, or for that matter, a policy or a company. But more than one major criticism of the concept of social license is that it tends to lead people to think that there's one community and one social license. That's not the case. A community always has multiple characteristics, multiple dimensions, and therefore we need to ensure that we have multiple social licenses from all the different subgroups within within a community, within the host communities. So clearly, organisations need to listen to all their stakeholders. Actually, this is a standard business principle that everybody has heard before. But I find that this is not quite sufficient because companies, projects also need to actively and meaningfully engage with their stakeholders. It's not just about listening, they need to actively and meaningfully engage, and they need to manage their social impacts. And social impact assessment, a field of research and practice, can help in this process. Thank you for listening.
Oké, welkom terug allemaal. We hebben hier een lijst vragen die zijn binnengekomen vanuit het publiek. So Frank, there are a couple of questions from the audience here. So I think they're partly related to the content of your story, partly related to the application to the gas extraction here in the north of the Netherlands. First of all, there was a question of clarification. Can you explain the difference between first and second order impacts to the audience?
Sure. So first order impact is what happens immediately. And the second order impacts is what happens next. And because the big difference between social impacts and environmental impacts, people react. And sometimes the way they react then goes on to cause more impacts. And how organizations react also causes more impacts. It's a sort of a semantic difference rather than perhaps and it's to people experiencing impacts, it probably makes no difference at all. But if we are trying to plot the path of how a project creates impacts, it becomes quite important, particularly when we think about predicting. So originally, social impact assessment was the process of predicting the impacts that are likely to occur in advance of the project. But actually, so many of the impacts can't be predicted because things happen along the way. Therefore, this process of ongoing monitoring and adaptive management is needed, especially to identify the impacts that happen later and the second and higher order impacts that are happening.
Okay, and if you applied it to the gas extraction, so we have the earthquakes, which the big one started in 2013. So what would be the first order, and what would then be a second order in this respect?
It's fair to say that quite likely the negative experience of the impacts is as much due to the failure of NUM to acknowledge that they were responsible for them. So it's actually largely related to a complete breakdown in trust between the community and the project.
So first you get the damage from the earthquakes, and then you get the response of the company to the complaints, which is then...
Well, in Schonebeek, where NUM had a good experience, there were also some problems. In fact, there was a spouter, a blowout, where the whole village got covered in oil and sand.
Really?
Yes. But what's interesting about that particular situation is because of the high social license to operate that NUM had, this was regarded as an accident that should not have happened. And all the documentary footage that exists gives the indication that although the accident happened, and it did not really change people's view of NUM at the time. So now the damage from earthquakes is considerable, but the damage to people's well-being is much more related to how NUM and the government have reacted rather than just to the earthquakes themselves.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, interesting. So there's also a question which is a bit related, and you already started talking about this a little bit. So you said in the beginning of social impact, people were really trying to predict the impacts, right? So what is a good way to get maybe not a full but a sufficient approximation of possible impacts. So have there been some kind of standards or developments or instruments?
So in the documents I showed you, there's one that's called the 2015 International Guidelines for Social Impact Assessment. It's published by the International Association for Impact Assessment. That provides a full elaboration of how social impact assessment can be used. One of the semantic confusions is that assessment tends to mean the ex-ante prediction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're trying to predict something in advance of the project. But the whole purpose is in order to manage them better. And part of the story is it's impossible to fully identify all of the impacts, and you need to have a process of ongoing management,
Mm-hmm.
monitoring and management to deal with that. So yes, by better assessment in the beginning, better qualified social impact assessment people, more serious attention given to this, greater consideration in how projects are developed.
Mm-hmm.
Far too many projects are viewed just as engineering or technical projects, right? How do we solve the technical issues? In exactly the same way that we give serious consideration to all the technical issues in projects, we need to give much more attention to what are the social issues that might be associated with projects. And that way we can improve the relationship between projects and communities. We can enhance the relationship. So here again, the more people are involved, the more that they accept the project as being worthwhile, the more they will be accepting of a project and less affected by any consequences.
Yeah.
The story about what happens if they dig up your street and whether or not you're upset by that or not, when you know it's inevitable and when you know it's for a good thing, then you can cope with the inconvenience. So the inconvenience or frustration from a project is more related to the legitimacy of the project rather than to whether there are impacts being created or not.
Yeah. So how would you describe the whole process related to the gas extraction in Groningen, if you take this perspective?
Well, up until earthquakes started happening, it was well done. The engineering issues were done brilliantly. The facilities were hidden from view in a lot of cases. They were not unduly negative in the landscape. But the great failure was to deny that the earthquakes could have been. So if you were knowing what we know now, and you could go back in time, what would you say? Well, don't deny from the beginning. At least say, well, maybe, and we'll investigate, and involve people in this. And potentially we could have had a situation where there would have been acceptance of the minor levels.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of fear was created about what happens if the earthquakes get bigger. The little earthquakes are troubling, perhaps, but they're more troubling if they create fear of a worse outcome. Right? There are lots of places in the world where there are minor traumas. People live with that. Some people actually think it's their sense of place. Actually, there's a paper about comparing Groningen with Kiruna in northern Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
So Kiruna in northern Sweden is an iron ore mine. The whole village has to be resettled so that the mining operations can continue. But one of the interesting things about here is that they let off explosive charges at midnight every night, and there's a lot of rumbling and noise, and that's part of the sense of place. So, of course, it's done in a controlled way where it wouldn't create a problem. But that notion of explosions in the middle of the night and the earth rumbling, that's part of the experience of the sense of place for people in the community. So
are you saying this happens for such a long time that it's part of their life?
Yes.
So if they don't hear an explosion during the night, they would miss it.
They would wake up.
Really? Oh, it's interesting. So, and if I reconstruct now what kind of happened here in Groningen, so there's an element to it that both the NAM and the government were always behind the facts, right? So that they responded slow. Is that something you agree on?
Yes. So
they created.
So first they denied. They were very reluctant, and then they did not really respond effectively at all. And then when it became so obvious that they had to admit it, then the procedures that were implemented for dealing with it were so laborious, and it made the whole community feel bad, right? And and that's still the case now. And we have a one of the important things to realise in the Groningen case is there's been a huge benefit to the state, right? From a comparison point of view in the world, this is probably the best example of where there is benefit sharing, with 40% of the ownership by the state in the operations, right? And the Netherlands as a whole has benefited enormously from this operation, much better than mining projects in almost every other context. But that arrangement has also led to a conflict of responsibility, because in other contexts, the state very clearly has a role in monitoring and ensuring good practice. Of course, in developing countries, that's not very well done often, and that's part of the problem. But in the Dutch context, the state for a long time had a conflict of interest, and it did not really know how to deal with this. And even now, we have excessive institutions involved. We have a lack of clear lines of responsibility, and a problem in how it's being done. In a different context, the company would have been much more responsive to restoring its social license to operate.
Okay, so there's another question which kind of relate to that. So once things started to get wrong, so is it then the responsibility of the government to build up the license to operate again, or the company? How do you look at it?
Well, that question follows very much on with what I just said.
Yeah.
So it depends on the context. And in Groningen, we have a situation where the state's a partner in the project, right? 40%.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a problematic situation, and to some extent, that's led to a confusion about roles. Companies in other contexts where it's clear that they're responsible and that they have the responsibility to act, they act immediately, right? And they act in a way that is less controlled by the state. So, in some cases it leads to a better outcome. In some cases it does not. It depends a little bit on the commitment to corporate social responsibility that companies have.
Mm-hmm.
With the social responsibilities of companies are changing a lot over the last 10, 20 years, especially because of the increasing importance of the business and human rights, and especially the 2011 document on the guiding principles on business and human rights.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So, so you actually think that the relation between the NAM and the government and the unclear roles, that the discussion, which I think in a way now the discussion has stopped, but until quite recently, that has been part of the fact that they didn't really respond very actively and
related to that is that the perception of local people is that the benefits all went to the central, national government in the West, not here in the North, and that can actually be backed up too in terms of looking at the allocation of funding. The North has missed out on its fair share, but in different contexts, companies would be much more committed to ensuring that there are much higher levels of social investment locally, and that much more awareness at the local level of the value to the local community from the project.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So here's this is kind of related question, but I'm still going to ask it. Can you say that the gas production in Groningen first had a positive or a neutral impact on society, but that it's only after the earthquake started to change, right? So
Yes, that's exactly the point, yes.
Yeah. Okay, very good. And here's another question. I think this is a more detailed one, but I think very relevant at this point for the people working in the field. The question is, in theory, the versterkingsopgaveproject, so now I have to translate this. This is the project to strengthen the buildings, right? So not to damage, but to strengthen the buildings. It should have a positive impact on society, but due to a lot of reasons, it's not seen as a positive project at the moment. What should we do to change this?
Yes, it's very complicated. And in fact, to some extent, you could say that the strengthening projects are creating more harm. For a start, there's a lot of construction happening. There's a lot of change happening. People, in some cases, are getting new houses. Now, to get a new house might be nice if that's what you wanted, but to be forced to have a new house when you wanted to stay in your old house is not positive, right? So perception is reality, and how people feel about things is really important. So getting a new house is beneficial, arguably, yes, maybe, but not if you didn't want that. Not if you're, people. That's sense of place is really important, and sense of place relates to your home. A home is a fundamental human right, and feeling safe in your home is really important. One of the worst consequences of the earthquakes is that it has led to this lack of feeling safe, and where your perception of your home has changed from being the safe haven to being a place of potential threat or risk to your life.
Yeah, that's an important element, I think, what you have seen the last few years, of course. One question from me. So you were also talking about the Swedish example, right? So that's an open mine pit, I assume?
It's a combination of open mine and underground.
Okay. So, but there, and I know you work more on this issue, there's a question that the whole community will be moved to another place. So the villages completely disappear. Is it possible to get like a PIMBY situation, that people are all positive about it? And if you talk about the sense of place and the whole village is gone, that's serious matter.
In Kiruna, the raison d'etre for the community, the city, is the mine. So even though you might not be completely happy about the process of moving, it's accepted by most people, not 100%, but it's accepted by most people because it's an essential part of maintaining the livelihood of people in the community. It's an essential part of the maintenance of livelihood. So there is acceptance of that. There are some dissenters, including indigenous peoples are there, Sami people around there, and maybe not enough consideration has been given in the arrangements there. But in general, there's acceptance of that, which reinforces the point I made earlier. When there is legitimacy to a project, people accept the inconvenience and the changes necessary that come with that.
Yeah. Okay. In that context, I think there's another question that might be relevant. So you were talking about not in my backyard. Do you think this phenomenon is growing in general in the Netherlands and in the world? I sometimes have the impression, if you read the newspapers, that this is getting into a larger and larger issue.
Well, I suspect that there is more talk of it, and it then becomes hard to establish are the number of cases increasing or not. Actually, there's a concept called environmental justice, which basically relates to areas where people are being harmed by projects, and there's an environmental justice atlas which catalogues. Actually, Groningen is on the map, unfortunately, and that would sort of suggest that the number is increasing. But it's also, remember what I said about NIMBY. there is an extent to which there will always be things like airports where no one really does want to live next to an airport, right? So locally unwanted land uses is a planning problem. And then the discussion is, well, how do you find siting for locally unwanted land uses, LULUs, right? The issue of the NIMBY has gone from a notion about that people would not like to live next to places to a complete discrediting of anybody who opposes projects, right? And we need to have a much more positive attitude about people who are defending their home. It's a part of their sense of place. It's only normal that people should defend their home and their community. That's really important. And the reaction of projects and communities should not be to belittle NIMBYists. I mean, the whole word NIMBYist is a terrible word, right? So the mindset should change from saying we should never think of NIMBY. We should think of how can we get PIMBY? What must we do, right? And that might change how you, like one of the issues in the world is how public sector determines appropriate compensation rates. And one of the problems is that public sector projects tend to be very restrictive in the type of compensation that they might provide. In private sector projects, they might be much more willing to provide additional compensation for pain and suffering. Right? Now, all you have to do is put pain and suffering in the schedule of things that it's legitimate to pay compensation for, and you have overcome one of the many issues. So being more generous and realising actually the great inconvenience that there is when people experience impacts or are living next door to projects. And, over time, there becomes a normalisation of the relationship between local communities and the project. It becomes part of your life as it becomes an interface. Some people even like living next door to airports.
Okay, so you would also suggest to a lot of new projects that are established or developed in the Netherlands that they first of all take NIMBY very serious and try to turn it into a more positive approach for the people involved. Do you think it's also wise for projects to make some kind of reservation, financial reservation upfront for unexpected events?
Of course, it's an essential part of management. If you did not have a budget for unexpected events, then you wouldn't be a very credible operator. Remember, one of the things that I said about that we should have is the operator has to have the skills and capacity to manage effectively, and that means having the budget to deal with that.
Yeah.
And so that's part of what we would expect, yes. Yeah. As well as the staff. So they need to have adequate staff to engage in appropriate community engagement.
Yeah.
They need to have proper skills in understanding the social issues. And remember, social issues are not black and white, they're complex.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that will be a wise approach for a lot of the newer projects. I think one of the things you also see in a lot of the new projects in the Netherlands, that they all start to point at Groningen. Right, so there's a lot of distrust which starts to copy to other fields as well. So probably a more active approach is then a better approach. And
yes.
to break as a government with what you have seen there, with what we are going to do now.
Well, I think the wind farm story is a little bit similar. It's very hard to get a wind farm up and running in the Netherlands because there's community opposition to that. Well, why should that be? I mean, it's terrible. We need wind farms make more economic sense in the Netherlands than solar farms. Why is it there is this opposition to wind farms? And part of it is that they've got a bad reputation, right? The first ones that were done did not properly engage with communities, and now there's this story about being harmful, and that's that experience is replicating.
Yeah.
So we need to do this much better.
Yeah.
Our future survival, achievement of Sustainable Development Goals, depends on doing projects better.
Yeah. Start from the beginning, so to say, doing a good
Yes.
project. Let me see. There are a couple of questions here. Let me say, this is a difficult question. So even the message, your house is safe, because we reduce the gas production and no longer think it has to be strengthened, can be a negative message for people not trusting the technical calculations and feeling not heard. Not sure, did you?
Yes, so one of the really important things in the experience of people is that they need to feel that they have been heard. And there's been in the Groningen context, there's been a complete lack of acceptance of the harm that people have had, but also I guess it's changing with all of the projects that the University of Groningen is doing, and other universities as well, where more and more of the statements of people are being said back. But actually the operator, NUM, and the government need also to acknowledge these harms, and they need to say the things that have been told to them, so that the people who are hurting can hear that they have been heard. It's a fundamental principle in community engagement.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So there's a final question. I'm trying to see if I can frame it in the right way in this particular discussion. This is a more personal question. So because many of the people who are watching are also working in the field, so they are confronted directly with the problems of the Groningen citizens. Do you think there are options for people in the field because they have to work already in a very negative environment, and that might increase the pressure on their work and make it more difficult to do that, to somehow release the pressure a little bit in their daily life? How can they themselves do something? Because we're talking systems and bigger policies and companies and governments, but essentially, if you have to do the work, it's...
Well, the social license to operate, it and the concept of trust and the reputation of a project, it actually depends on the actions, behaviours, statements of everything, especially frontline staff, right? If an organisation's frontline staff present a bad experience, then that's what happens. So, and similarly, frontline staff in this context where there's a lot of anger will have to face the brunt of that anger. Now, with protest, how companies and their security forces or the police, how they react has the potential to escalate harm and violence, or it has the potential to de-escalate. So every company, every project, every security force has to carefully think how they manage. Do they want to lead to escalation, or they want to de-escalation? Now, it's sort of curious because one-on-one situations become similar in a community situation, because in the end, what happens in a community is also is like a replication of one-on-one situations. So when it's very tempting for company staff or even the people in the audience today, when they're faced with anger, to react defensively. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, most people's defensive reactions tend to not give the feeling that people need to hear that they have been heard. Mm-hmm. And it's quite important that the frontline staff really consider how they can act not defensively, but act in ways that validate the concerns and feelings of people, go beyond the anger So when people express their anger and it's acknowledged and their feelings behind that are acknowledged, after a little while they come to a point when especially when it's been acknowledged, that then there can be a discussion around, well, what's the basis of this and what can we do to resolve it? But a defensive reaction will just escalate the situation.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the problem that we're in. Now, for other situations, the analysis is, this is a terrible situation to be in. And it's much better to deal with problems early on so they don't deteriorate to the situation that we have now. It's a real shame that NUM did not acknowledge the issues much earlier, and that the arrangements between the government and NUM did not allow for a more effective and less bureaucratic and drawn-out procedure earlier on.
Yeah.
So my only advice is keep your cool, acknowledge the feelings and anger, and try to find a solution.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think these are very nice and interesting words. Thank you for your presentation, Frank.